In continuing our study of the synthesis of yoga in the chapter titled Oneness, we have come to an aspect of the integral yoga which is central to Sri Aurobindo's approach to the yoga and to its integrality. We saw how one can live in a consciousness of oneness, and even that this realization of oneness and the practice of oneness in difference is the whole of yoga. And yet, one can recognize within the oneness that the cosmos itself is split into two. There is the upper half in which the Satchidananda is unveiled, and the lower half where it is veiled. And in our own consciousness, although we may live equally in both, we still experience them as two separate halves, as something with a gap in between. And in order to be able to bridge that gap, the effort that has to be made is the discussion that we are at. We have to review and remold the lower in the light of the higher. And this process can take us far, but it will never be complete or really executed without some essential principle that is found which already links the two. And this he describes as the awakening of the truth mind, which corresponds in the mental being to the supermind and is capable of receiving mentally its illuminations. There is something within the domain of our mind which has the capacity to receive from the upper half the illuminations in the way that the mind can recognize. In our practical experience, we know this in the form of intuition, a flash of light, and suddenly you know. Or it takes one of several forms, which are all aspects of the intuition, where there is a conscious inspiration in which a will as if inspires and carries you to do something which you may not fully understand while you're doing, but which is precise, exact, and leads to the result required. Or there is a revelation, something seen without any intention to know, and the knowledge which is revealed is so rich and complete, it could never have been constructed. Or there is the fine sense of discrimination in which you just feel within this whole body of knowledge something is true and something is mixed, and you just know it. In all these fourfold phenomena of intuition, it is an aspect of the supermind which is entering in the normal working of the mind as a ray of light, as a finite front tip of something which is itself infinite and beyond mind. And these direct truth perceptions, he said, they all come from the supermind, which is what creates the universal order out of infinity. It is the will that knows and the knowledge that effects. Will and knowledge are merged in that. Its awakening into action brings down all those things which the Veda describes, and it awakening, it reveals Satchidananda, because it's the link point between our human experience of the world and the Satchidananda which we are unable to access in the human experience. It reveals Satchidananda. And then Sri Aurobindo went through 4 sentences in which he describes that movement of the revealing as the light of the supermind begins to dawn, as its influence begins to enter and increase in us. What happens in our knowledge, in our will, in our enjoyment of life, and in our sense of the universal things and movements. And we saw how, and we went in much detail in this, the emergence of this supramental influence puts all the scattered and ill-combined suggestions of our mind into harmony, and the result is it makes it to fall into its place in the unity of the truth behind all the different pieces of our thoughts and mind, and there is a transformation from half light of mind into a certain totality of light. In the same way, it reveals the will behind all the devious and imperfectly regulated strivings of the mental will, emotional wishes, and vital efforts. Every impulse within us is a broken fragment of a deeper will reflecting and then breaking into these fragments. And as the light of the supermind brings this influence, all these fragments begin to fall into their right place, and there is a sense of a luminous will behind which unites everything. And the third sentence was of the delight, for which each of our sensations and emotions is groping, from which they fall back. And this reveals the delight. And as it reveals the delight, it makes each to fall into place in the unity of a universal delight behind. And all the conflicts and dualities within our emotions are unified into a certain totality of serene, yet profound and powerful love and delight. These three, you can see, are significant. They represent aspects of the Satchidananda emerging in the normal working of our mind, our will, and our emotions. But then there is the fourth sentence, which puts in all in context of a larger universal action, in which you see, as it reveals the universal action, it shows the truth of being out of which each of its movements arises and to which each progresses, the force that effectuates all these movements, and the delight of being for which each of these lives to fulfill, from which each of these is born, and relates everything to the universal being, consciousness, force, and delight of Satchidananda. The result is practically everything, all the divisions or contradictions are harmonized, and it shows us in them the one and the infinite. Even as we look at everything which was fragmented, now everything falling into spontaneous harmony and order, we begin to perceive the one and the infinite behind everything and within everything. And we read these lines, studied them in great detail. And then there is the next sentence, which is the result of all this in our consciousness, which we read last time, but which we need to explore further. I'll first read it. Uplifted into this supramental light, pain and pleasure and indifference begin to be converted into joy of the one self-existent delight. Strength and weakness, success and failure begin to be converted into powers of the one self-effective force and will. Truth and error, knowledge and ignorance begin to be converted into light of the one infinite self-awareness and universal knowledge. Increase of being and diminution of being, limitation and the overcoming of limitation are converted into waves of the one self-realizing conscious existence. And he summarizes this into all our life, and as all our essential being is transformed into the possession of Satchidananda. Now this passage, when we read, of course it is so profound, we feel an uplift, we feel an inspiration, and there's something so deep that the mind cannot grasp, and so our mind is stunned. But to be able to fully appreciate what he has brought together, there are threads which he has developed, discussed in great detail elsewhere, and then he brings it all together into one single movement of the awakening which is described. And it is helpful for our mind to not only receive the impulse of what he describes, but also understand and appreciate how, the logic of it, the mechanism of it. Otherwise, something within says, it just happens. The supermind dawns and all these things change. Yes, of course, that is true. But why and how? What's the underlying mechanism? Why is it that its dawning makes for this? And then we will understand why this dawning is essential for this to become perfect and complete. And so last time we had explored in some detail this transition of pain, pleasure and indifference beginning to be converted into joy of the one self-existent delight. We saw how pain and pleasure are nothing but a split, a division of a spectrum of experience, of sensation, which when the sensation or experience becomes too intense for our limited consciousness to bear, we experience as pain. When it is well within the reach of our capacity, we experience it as pleasure. When neither pain nor pleasure can be grasped, we have the neutral poise of indifference, which again prepares us for another cycle of experience of pain or pleasure and so on. But this division, this split is the result of our divided consciousness and the incapacity which comes with it. The Divine Himself, as He holds the whole universe in His consciousness, can experience the full intensity of a supernova exploding, an entire galaxy exploding or collapsing, and would experience it as a delight because the whole is never changed. The whole is never threatened. The whole is never overwhelmed. You have only an intense wave or a small wave, but the whole remains whole. If you are a small part meeting this intense wave, obviously you are overwhelmed by pain. If you are a large part in a small wave, it can be pleasurable or barely felt. But this limitation of your consciousness is what makes for this split. In a consciousness that lives in the totality, there is this change that takes place. And it doesn't happen overnight. He describes a continuum of experience uplifted into this supramental light. These things begin to be converted into. All these things begin to be converted into. As the uplifting begins to take place, this transition begins to happen. And I'm highlighting this, as I mentioned last time, because it points to the fact that this can begin even now. The beginning can be made from the point where your consciousness begins to open out to these direct truth perceptions, and these are well within our reach. The next part of the change which he describes is strength and weakness, success and failure begin to be converted into powers of the one self-effective force and will. So now we are seeing two different things. Strength and weakness begin to be converted into one self-effective will, or powers or aspects of the one self-effective will. The other side, success and failure begin to be converted into one self-effective, strength and weakness begin to be converted into one self-effective force, and success and failure into one self-effective will. And why this? There are two here and two here. And what's the connection? Let's explore the relationship. Strength and weakness are what you feel inside you subjectively. The result of your strength and weakness externally in your action is success and failure. Internally, what you experience is force, which is greater or lesser. When the force is great, your strength is great. When the force is less, well, you feel weak. Its result outside, success and failure, is the effective action of the will or the failure of the will. Force internally, subjectively, will externally in the domain of action, where you have success and failure. Now, once we recognize he's describing both these things, let's see how these relate to and how they are changed by the dawning of this consciousness, being uplifted in the light of the supramental. Remember, the supramental is the consciousness which is infinite. Being infinite, it sees things always in wholes, in continuums. It does not divide. So when it sees one thing, it sees the one thing in the context of the whole, not only in space, not only in time, but also in chains of causality. So while you may look at just this piece of action and see its failure, it sees how even the failure of this is part of a larger movement which is ascending to a success further on, in a different time, in a different space. As an example, you will recall the mother narrating her recollections of certain lives, and one in particular in Egypt, where there was an effort to create this new city and the new religion of the sun to unite under the light of the ideal of a higher divine oneness. And it failed. Do you remember the king, the form in which it was? Akhenaten? Yes, Akhenaten. And he tried to create the religion of the worship of the one sun, the source of all things. But it failed, and it faded into history as one effort which was perhaps crazy, perhaps premature. And Mother refers to that and says that it was one of the early efforts preparatory to the current action or effort of creating Auroville. And she says it was destined to fail. It was known that it would fail. But she said it was necessary to keep alive the ideal. Now you see, in the larger picture of time, something is intended to be achieved far away, 3,000 years later, something like that. But if you wait 3,000 years in order to make that effort, when the world is perhaps more ready, the efforts made in the past would not be linked with the future, because the memory of the past efforts were drowning, they were fading. We do not remember racially or in our history the work done at the time of what is known as Atlantis, or before that, the time of Lemuria. But great efforts were made, extraordinary achievements were attained and lost. And then there was a great passage of destruction and loss, because many things had to be lost. But what had to be retained, certain essential ideals and efforts, had to be taken forward until the next readiness in history. But if you allow too long a gap, it fades. We do not know anymore the way people thought then, the way they felt, the way they saw their worldview and values, or maybe some fragments distorted remain. So in between, you need these efforts to draw the best of the past, give it a new form as relevant for the current circumstance, and push forward as far as you can, knowing that it is not yet time for its realization. And it fails. And then again, when there is a necessity, there is a possibility of a loss of memory, or the energy of what is built up may be too far faded. Again there is an effort, and again there is an effort, until the time for fulfillment arrives. Now imagine when there is this large movement taking place, there are certain souls which come repeatedly to participate in those efforts. In the perspective of the soul, and especially a more awakened soul who is conscious of this need to, this choice to participate in this awakening, the moment it senses that nature or the divine will is preparing for a new burst of that light, it is eager. It wants to take birth. It aligns itself for the best opportunities for participation. Looks for environment, circumstances, or imprints that would assist in the way it wants to participate, and comes again and again and again. From a perspective, some certain perspective, or from a more human perspective, we will say, but failure, failure, failure. Frustration, frustration, frustration. And perhaps, but the soul's perspective is different. Each time we grew closer, each time something new and something more was attained, and we grew with it. But we don't know yet when it will happen. And there is a separate discussion that the mother has in the playground when she is speaking to the children, when she says to them, well, not the children, the sadhaks and the children, she says to them that all of you here are here for a reason. She says, you may not remember, you are not conscious, but you were all promised that when the time for realization would come, you would be given a chance. And that's why you've been brought here and given that chance. And you see what that means for us. Having been through those efforts, maybe once, maybe twice, maybe through all of them, when the time for fulfillment comes, there is this divine grace that gives you the opportunity, draws you, puts you in relation to this effort. And after that, well, you've been given the chance. You may catch it, you may not, you may lose it, you may make partial use of it, you may wander off. It's left to you. But the chance was given because the divine promised. In this large perspective, would you say those were failures? Would you say they were successes? You see, neither term really applies. Both terms fail. Yes, they were successes because something great was achieved. They were failures because the achievement didn't last. And even your work now, in this life, whatever you may do, from a certain perspective, you will never reach the ideal. So it's a failure already, pre-planned, because you can't reach the ideal. On the other hand, the amount of progress and the fulfillment that you have in your growth and in serving the ideal and manifesting something new, and the new world and the new consciousness which is being born, to be part of that, what a great privilege, what an opportunity, what a great success. So the terms success and failure kind of fade, and you see instead underlying one great will, unified. It's working everywhere through everything. And then there are these special focal points of its action which come up again and again. But they are part of a single movement of one great will. So success and failure are transformed into one self-effective will. It is effective in itself. It does not need anything else for its result. When it chooses to do something, it assembles the materials, it creates the materials where it does not have them, and fulfills itself irrespective of our limitations. Of course, for it, time and space and circumstance are free and open. There's plenty of time, plenty of space. When it decides the time is now, well, it does it. When it decides that it is preparing, then it wanders around, creating the foundation, creating the materials, creating the resources, linking them until it says, okay, now I'm ready. And poof, it moves and unites everything. There is an aphorism, Sri Aurobindo, which would be worth understanding in this context, where he uses this phrase. He speaks of God circling. He says, when I don't have it now, He speaks of this whenever it appears as if something has failed or it's not working. He says, I see only God circling around his goal. Preparing, but it's still part of the goal. Never is it abandoned. Even after that great effort made, which is then collapsed, there is this lull where nothing seems to happen. That same will is taking the imprint of what was created, settling it, spreading it, to create a wider imprint, wider action for the next push. If you look at the development of Europe, there is the Roman Empire. It imprinted certain values. It rose, it collapsed. You visit Rome today, you see only the ruins. Nothing of the empire remains in its form. But in the values that it imprinted, it defines the Europe of today. And the particular imprint of values that defines the Europe of today then is used through a colonial phase from Europe to spread those same values all over the world. Nothing is left out. You can barely find a handful of patches on earth where human beings live, still isolated from what we call modern civilization. But so much of modernity is really the imprint which was created then during the Roman Empire on Europe and thence from Europe upon the world through colonization. And other elements from Greece and from other cultures similarly. When you see the big picture, you see only one will, universal, self-effective, and its rhythms and its free choices as it moves forward. And so success and failure has no meaning anymore in this dawning of the supramental light as the mind is uplifted into it. And this is as far as the external action is concerned. What about internally, subjectively? I experience strength and weakness. What happens to that? What do I find subjectively? What is strength? What is weakness? If you observe, weakness is an incapacity, strength is the same incapacity now developed more. And it's only part of a continuum. There's a very interesting example of how a consciousness that lives in a larger span of time and space sees these. And it comes in a fascinating movie which is called Edge of Tomorrow. Edge of Tomorrow. I don't know if you've seen that movie. If you have not, it is worth seeing just for this purpose, for the message that it conveys. And the storyline is that there is this person, he's a soldier in the middle of a war in which there are some robotic beings who are part of a hive mind, but with a capacity to cross the barrier of time. So every time a robotic being comes and you kill it, it absorbs the knowledge of how it was killed into the hive mind, goes back into time, rebuilds itself now with the knowledge of how to overcome this method of killing it. And somehow the protagonist of the story, he is imbibed with some of this robotic blood or liquid and becomes part of this. And so what happens? He works now to defeat the robots. Every time he comes forward and the robot kills him, he finds himself thrown back in time to restart. Now, having set this base, you see what happens next. He gets up, starts doing something, it fails. He goes back, restarts. This time he knows what's going to happen, so a missile is going to pass over him, he knows exactly when to duck. And he misses it. He goes the next step, gets hit by a mine, restart. Now he knows there's a mine there, he knows to avoid it. Now consider what this example is showing you. A consciousness which is fundamentally free from the limitation of time and can experience life in whatever way it wants and can take as long as it wants, has all the time in the world to learn, to grow, to overcome whatever its limitations are, and keep going until everything can be overcome. So he keeps on going until, as the movie progresses, now he can go very far. He knows exactly how to navigate all the dangers because he's been through them all, experienced them all, made all the mistakes possible, and now he knows the right path until he gets to whatever it is he has to do. I won't tell you the ending of the movie. It's worth seeing just for that, if you enjoy science fiction. But now we connect this to our soul, the psychic being, as an emanation of the divine consciousness put out in time. It experiences, it knows its sense of immortality. It knows that in the unfolding time it is eternal. It knows that in the journey there is no hurry, because you have all the time in the world, and in eternity of time. You can rush if you're in a hurry for something in relation to others. You see, what's the sense of hurry? I must do this within the next 500 years, keeping in mind the current trend of human evolution. But if you don't have that reference, 500 years has no meaning, 5,000 years has no meaning. You see, only if you know that in the next 10 years there is going to be this progress of humanity, well, I need to go faster than that. That was the reference. But you remove all references, time does not matter. Whether I do it in 5 years or 500 years or 5 million years, enjoy the journey. And when you have that sense of eternity, well, what's the meaning of strength and weakness? I have a weakness, all right, let me play with it. Let me enjoy what the weakness is like, until in the very act of experimenting and experiencing it, I outgrow it. And then I discover another aspect of weakness, and I play and experiment. The moment you have eternity before you, strength and weakness have no meaning. All you have is experience of growth, unending. All you have is drawing out your innate potentialities without any essential limitation. It's only a question of which line you choose to develop first, which aspect, which experience you wish to play with more or less, through which development you want to speed up, through which you want to go slow. But eventually all weaknesses are overcome. Everything is growth. There's no sense of strength or weakness. What do you have instead? A pure force pushing forward. One force working through this, through that, through the other limitations or strengths. But it is one force unfolding, drawing out the innate possibilities, which are, and when you look within, this psychic being leans back and is a part of the self. All potential, infinite potential held in this seed form, so to say. How much can you grow? Which direction can you grow? You are utterly free to explore. Of course, there is a force which came in the very emergence of the psychic being, and that is the force which is driving the whole evolution. It has already set an overall sense of direction and priorities. And so all you have is one self-effective force. It needs nothing externally. It's going to grow irrespective of it. It uses everything that comes its way in order to grow. So one self-effective force. So now we reread this sentence and you see what he is conveying here. Strength and weakness begin to be converted into one self-effective force. Success and failure begin to be converted into powers of one self-effective will. And why? You can see the consciousness that's dawning, the mind being uplifted into this oneness underlying, in which you see everything in continuums of space, time and causality. Freedom of the self, working through causality, not bound to anything. Next line, next phrase in the sentence is, truth and error, knowledge and ignorance, into light of the one infinite self-awareness and universal knowledge. So again, it relates to something which is subjective and objective. Truth and error is a poise of consciousness. We will explore this. And it leads to practically, in your activity, in your expression, in nature, knowledge or ignorance. And the truth and error begin to be converted into the light of one self, in one infinite self-awareness, and the knowledge and ignorance begin to be converted into the light of one infinite universal knowledge. So let's now explore each of these the way we have done with the will and force. So what is truth? And its counterpart, he says, is error, not falsehood. What does he mean? So we explore this a little bit. Opposite of truth? Well, we would have said falsehood, but he's saying error. So he's using truth in a different sense. Not statement is true and so that statement is false. The sense of truth is something more essential. Error being its opposite, now you can recognize what is truth. So for example, your mind says, this statement is true, that statement is false. If you are right, that's truth. You are right that this is false. But if when you said this is true, you were wrong, that's error. If you said this is false and you are wrong, that is error. So you see, it is one meta level above true-false. It is the sense of innate truth that is right in itself. It cannot be wrong. Or it is error because something is warped, something is limited, something is missed. So it is a movement, something within your state of consciousness turning and spontaneously in its action, in its knowledge, it is true, or something is wrong and it is error. And this is a poise of consciousness. As the mind is uplifted into the supramental light, this spontaneous discrimination of what is true and what is error, or the spontaneous state of being which is true, or the state of being which is misaligned and therefore error, grows into the light of one infinite self-awareness. Now you notice where the error comes from. When you are true, you are as if in sync with everything. What is error? When that sync is somehow broken. When you are true, what you perceive, what you act, what you do is somehow aligned with exactly what it should be in relation to the larger movement. What is error? When something is broken, something is disconnected, something is out of sync with the larger whole. The correction from error to truth, therefore, is the reconnecting to the whole in a deeper harmony. And how would that happen? As your consciousness opens out into one single light of the one infinite self-awareness. You're aware of everything infinitely self-aware. And at that point you're in sync. Everything you do is true. There is no misalignment and therefore no error. So the difference of truth and error in life fades away and there is only this one self-awareness, infinite. Practically, in your action, this reflects in the form of knowledge and ignorance. When you are aligned to the truth, what you know is true, or you do not know, or what you know is false. And knowledge, ignorance is the form that it takes in your dealings with things. And so this is the aspect of the life and expression. This is transformed into one infinite universal knowledge. So when the consciousness becomes whole, what you know also widens to include everything. In practice, this takes the form, and we have discussed this many times before, in the working of the intuition, in the Vedic symbolism, this is described as a flash of lightning. When you're in darkness of the night, there's a flash of lightning, momentarily you glimpse. But you glimpse only as much as your vision is able to see at that moment. You do not see what is behind you. You can only see what is just in front of your eyes. You cannot see beyond what is your eyes, beyond the wall. So the flash of lightning reveals. And while it could have given you much more, your capacity to receive is narrow. So the first thing that happens is your knowledge glimpse in the flash of lightning of intuition is narrow, and the first thing happening is that it begins to become wider. In the flash of lightning, what was true, real is revealed. What is not within your range is not seen by you, but because of the flash of lightning, you know it exists, but you do not know what it is. So the character of the intuition at first is finite, narrow, knowing exactly what it knows, but also knowing that it does not know beyond this edge. And so it does not make errors. It has the character of truth, although limited, although finite. The error would be to say, I know this and I also know much more, when in fact I don't know. And this is the problem with the mind. We do not know what we know, and we do not know what we don't know. When I was very young, I had read somewhere this very beautiful quotation, and it struck me so deeply that it has remained burnt in. I'm going to remember it after 10 years at least. But it goes something like this. He who knows not, and knows not that he knows not, is a fool. You see, you don't know, and you don't even know that you don't know. He's a fool. Shun him. He who knows not, and knows that he knows not, is a child. Teach him. He who knows, and knows not that he knows, is asleep. Wake him. He who knows and knows that he knows is wise. Follow him. Very beautiful. It puts into 4 categories. And so the problem we have is that we don't even know what we know. We don't know what we don't know. And just because we think we know this, we think we also know more. And that's why all the errors come. And there are 2 categories of errors, wrong knowing and wrong not knowing. But still, the act of the flash of intuition is to show the perimeter of your knowledge. And therefore you can't make a mistake. When you are asked, you can say, I don't know. Or I know partially and I know that it's mixed, but I know it's not fully true. What I know to be true, I know. And the rest also, I know that I don't know. First level. And then what happens? Your edges also initially are blurred. They become more defined. You are more conscious of the transition. And the ray begins to widen. Increasingly, as the consciousness receiving widens, in the flash of lightning, you see more and more. Until, as far as the mind can contain a glimpse of something which is really vast. And then there's still a problem. It came as a flash. In the moment I saw. What happens after? I don't know. What was before? I don't know. And the glimpse that is limited to what was shown in that flash. And so in the Vedic description, you see the next stage beyond this to be flash followed by flash. And so you have a flash, starting with a small flash. You sense that there's something important here, but I don't know it. You put your attention to want to know, and second flash. And you see a link, and there's something there which is more important, which this leads to flash, flash, flash. And whatever your mind turns to wish to know, you have a flash. And a series of flashes. And so you can see how series of flashes, each growing over time to be more and more complete. With a little more time, and the flashes now come on demand. They come spontaneously. You don't even intend to know. The very fact that your attention turns to something, poof, there's a flash. You know. Until it becomes so natural, you live in an intuitivized mind where the intuition acts irrespective of whether you make an effort to know or not. Except it's coming in flashes, larger and larger. And at one point, the flashes become flickering until it's continuous and then it's sustained. What happens then? You don't call it lightning anymore. You call it the dawning of the light, which increases and becomes brighter and clearer. It's now the sun emerging. It's no more the night. It is day of the supramental light, growing, widening, and so on. But that is a fundamental transition from the flashes of lightning to the dawning of the day. And let's explore why this transition becomes critical. In the infinity of the perception of the flash, it feels as if you're seeing all knowledge. But here's the interesting thing. The container in which you're seeing, with which you know, is still your mind. Innately, the mind is limited. And although you may see a huge chunk, as big as your galaxy, and therefore everything of your little earth is included and so much more, you're so overwhelmed with the entire galaxy in relation to the little earth that you wish to know and live in, that it feels like you know everything. And at that point comes the big error. You have this big knowledge, and with it comes humongously large error, because beyond your galaxy you do not know. And that impacts your earth also. So Sri Aurobindo makes this very interesting observation that as you enter this over mental consciousness, where you begin to see this even in glimpses of infinities, that's when you have the most extreme form of the ignorance, where another infinity not known to you also exists, which totally contradicts your infinity. But because it is infinity which is contradicted by infinity, it's as if the ignorance is exaggerated and infinite. This is the problem when you look at religions. They build an entire complex worldview around a certain glimpse of the divine. God is love. And you build the whole worldview around it, going down to the intricacies of all life's details. Everything is organized around this one glimpse. And then another religion comes and says, God is power, and builds a whole different worldview. And each has fully covered the whole earth and all life. But when the two meet, there is an enormous collision of opposites. They do not see eye to eye, cannot see eye to eye, nothing in common. And then something else comes and says, God is knowledge, God is mercy, God is justice, God is transcending form, and all forms therefore are wrong. And you can see how each of these views can build a whole civilization, religion, form of worship, practice, relationship to God, intricately complex, infinitely rich and diverse, and yet be totally incompatible with the others. This is the problem with mind. As long as all this is happening in the domain of mind, even though your mind opens out to infinity, it can never be infinite. And that's why there has to be that transition out of mind to something which is essentially infinite, in which all these extreme infinite facets are seen as facets of one. And only that can reconcile and experience all of these as facets of one. Until then, we have ignorance, we grow out of ignorance, but into greater ignorance. And that's the paradox of mind, you see. You're growing into knowledge, and the knowledge is growing, and yet you do not realize that all the great knowledge you have does not know an entire infinity which is beyond it. And so your ignorance is also that much greater, because you cannot know or do not know of that which is beyond. Of course, when it is the intuition leading, it knows that there is that, but it has no capacity to know that other, because it is so overwhelmed with this. And this is the overmental poise from which one has to break out of the mind fundamentally into the supermind. And that's when the dawning of the sun takes place. The night is gone. No more lightnings, no more night. It is dawning of the sunlight. And it is this which he is speaking of in this passage. Uplifted into this supramental light. Truth and error, knowledge and ignorance are converted into light of the one infinite self-awareness and universal knowledge. And finally, the last, which we had briefly played with last time, increase of being and diminution of being. Limitation and the overcoming of limitation are converted into waves of the one self-realizing conscious existence. So this is the relationship of the domain of form with the upper half of the cosmos, Satchidananda. Everything below the supermind, because it moves to fragment itself, to division of consciousness, belongs to and is characterized by some sense of limitation, some sense of boundaries, some sense of growth and diminution the moment you have boundaries and limitations. Of this, the culmination is in matter. In the physical world, form is the dominant thing and persistence of form. But the whole range across the physical world, vital and mental worlds, is characterized by boundaries, and therefore with it increase and diminution. Now comes the interesting thing. Whatever scale you look at, you will find there is increase and there is diminution. So let's take an example here. You set a boundary, cut up the air. Let's conceive of air as an ether or a continuum which is infinite. You cut it up here. Make pockets, cut it up into squares of whatever size, 1 foot each square. You have a boundary here between two squares of 1 foot each. Let's increase this one. As you increase it, what happens? The square of the neighbor diminishes. What has increased? What has diminished? Well, this one increased, that one diminished. That's the price you pay. But if you shift your consciousness to the totality of the air, what has increased and what has diminished? It's meaningless. A piece of myself increases and a piece of myself gives in to the increase of the other and experiences the sense of diminution. But what is it behind one self-realizing conscious existence, working in increasing this, diminishing that, for a purpose? Look at your body. Look at the lungs inside. Let's observe it through an MRI scan which is live. You see the lungs expand, pushing other organs to take their place. And you see the lungs squeezing, allowing other organs to come back to their place. Inside, internally, within the body structure, there is something expanding, another thing contracting, and all you see is a movement across, a play between different parts, isn't it? Ultimately, it is one body which is realizing itself as a living being and using these rhythms to do something. The heart expands to suck blood, and there is less blood momentarily in the arteries which feed the heart. And then the heart pushes, contracts to push, and there is more blood in the arteries pushing out from the heart. But if you look at the big picture of the body, well, that's a necessary rhythm for the maintenance of the body. It's one coordinated, self-realizing conscious existence. Now scale this into the infinity. of the whole universe and every movement of the universe. When the tiger eats the tiger is increased, the deer is diminished. Right? Is anything lost? Is anything gained in the overall forest? Nothing. A tree bursts out into bloom of 1,000,000 flowers. As winter sets in, all the leaves are shed, they all dry up, they all fall, they become manure. What a waste. And then they're all recycled, drawn in again in new form and round by shed across species of plants, animals. The whole forest is intact. And so the phrase he uses, increase of being and diminution of being, limitation and the overcoming of limitation, are gradually transformed into waves of the one self-realizing conscious existence. One wave rising, next to the wave there is a dip. One wave collapsing, the dip rises, but the ocean is always one self-realizing conscious existence. Now, when you look at all of the reality in the domain of mind, life and matter, all you see is these waves rising and falling and playing along and combining in more and more complex ways. If you look at empty space, an humongous amount of energy which is held there in what is called zero-point energy, and this is conventional physics. Out of that, the emergence of matter is barely like foam floating on the surface of the wave. Matter emerges, an entire galaxy emerges, and it is barely foam on the surface of this humongous energy which is behind. An entire galaxy lapses back. Nothing is lost, nothing is gained, everything is there. All you had was a wave rising and falling. If you observe clouds, sometimes on a clear sky you see a cloud forming, a small patch, then it grows. Or you watch a large cloud and it seems to fade out. Or you watch a cloud, one side is fading out, another side is growing, but the cloud is not moving. All of these phenomena are simply emergences and diminutions within the larger oneness which never changes. And so as this supramental light dawns and the mind is lifted into it, it sees all these movements of increase of being and diminution of being as waves of one self-realizing conscious existence. Now, first was being, which is the internal I am. I am cloud, I am tiger, I am deer, I am galaxy, or whatever it is. Increasing or diminishing. And the other is the aspect in action. My internal increase or diminution is not the focus here. In my action, I have limitation and I overcome limitation. You see, this is an exercise externally, objectively, of the same increase diminution, which is a psychological, subjective experience. Limitation. I can only do this much. I cannot jump higher. I cannot jump farther. And now I struggle to overcome my limitation. And again, from this perspective, it is only waves of one self-realizing conscious existence. If you look at humanity as a whole, you'll see something very interesting. Whatever the limitations we have as an internal design in our capacity of human nature, biological, energetic, psychological knowledge, whatever it is, there is a steady progress in spite of everything else. One of the examples I've often given here is of the Olympics. Going back in the last 100 years, every time you have the Olympics, every 4 years, the record for the 100 meters run is always broken. And every time it was the limit of the biology of human design, of your genetics, heredity, tissue, structure and material, and it's being pushed. And that tells you something. In the capacity of the vitality and energy and the tissue's ability to not break down under that much struggle, you see the run of the marathon or the 1 minute mile. And we've seen the pattern again and again. It was impossible for a long time until somebody broke that barrier And the next year, several people broke that barrier. And in a few years after, in 10 years, 20 years, it's part of the normal training to be able to go and break that barrier. The first time the gymnast, Nadia Comaneci, I think, got 100%. It was incredible. You could not believe that somebody could do an action which was perfect. Today it is the norm. If you cannot reach that 100% in your practice sessions, you can't even enter the Olympics, except as one of the sidekicks. You're not nowhere near the center. What does it mean? It means there's something happening at the species level which is growing. There's an interesting study to show animals in contact with human beings are showing increase of intelligence, adapting to human circumstances in ways that were impossible. There's an interesting report I saw only this morning of a certain breed of cats which are able to swim. And at certain species, they dive into water, they can even go underwater and they catch fish. They like swimming in the water. They do stay away from human beings. They do not enter cities. Except they recently discovered some cats in Sri Lanka, in Colombo, which were living in the city, no water access. They had found a way to enter inside human habitations, go through complex mazes of building structures in order to reach an aquarium, dive into it and catch fish and eat. So they tagged these. They found 4 or 5 of them in the whole city. They tagged them and found them demonstrating an intelligence which was far above the normal cat behavior and instinct. And the conclusion they came to is cats being exposed to human habitation are actually growing in intelligence. They show complexity of intelligence which in the wild they would never have had. Or if you only take a dog which has been trained in human influence, you can see that dog's intelligence and the dog in the wild, they have grown. Everything is growing slowly. If you accelerate your span of time, you will see such a rapid growth. And it is what this is pointing to. Limitation and the overcoming of limitation is nothing but waves of one self-realizing conscious existence. It chooses to wave out, it pushes, overcomes all limitations across time, across forms of species, doesn't matter, but it is one conscious existence realizing itself. Now look at the entire universe as one gigantic wave. It is one self-realizing conscious existence in one gigantic wave unfolding itself. And you're seeing everything as this. Now we'll read the whole sentence again and you see what he captures in this grand vision. Remember, it's the limit of the mind. The mind has gone as far as it can or is pushed to the limit, and then it must be uplifted into the supramental light. So, uplifted into this supramental light, pain, pleasure and indifference begin to be converted into joy of the one self-existent delight. Strength and weakness, success and failure, into powers of the one self-effective force and will. Truth and error, knowledge and ignorance, into one light of the one infinite self-awareness and universal knowledge. Increase of being and diminution of being, limitation and the overcoming of limitation, into waves of the one self-realizing conscious existence. What you see across all these is the one self-existent delight, one self-effective force and will, one infinite self-awareness and universal knowledge, and one self-realizing conscious existence. That's all that's pushing forward through all these, which we see within the domain of forms and play of finites and limits, which are part of the lower half of the cosmos. Now you see what Sri Aurobindo has done. He showed us how first this revealed Satchidananda was in the upper half, concealed Satchidananda in the lower half. The two could not meet. There was nothing in common. Even if we live in one consciousness, in a oneness that spans both, they still appear separate. And now what he did was, taking us through this process, which is described over the last two paragraphs, he has shown how these two can be healed, and that which is above can penetrate the lower and then raise the lower into its terms. And the result is, the lower experience still operates within form. Form is not neutralized. Still works within boundaries and limits. They are not gone. But now we see them as a continuum of the revealed Satchidananda above, which now enters and reveals itself below in the play of the finites and boundaries below. And this is the extraordinary result of this process. We now see Satchidananda, which was concealed, more and more revealed. Within ourselves, subjectively, we experience its existence, and in our actions and expression in life, it begins to play out more and more directly. And all of these four things, remember, are described in a continuum, begin to be converted into. There is a continuous change happening. The conversion is taking place. What happens then when this conversion goes all the way? All our life, as well as all our essential being, is transformed into the possession of Satchidananda. This phrase, possession of Satchidananda, is very important. So all of our life, this is the experience you have engaging with the world, and then all of our essential being, which is what you are essentially in consciousness. Now, in engaging with the world, it's not just the stuff outside your body. It also includes your body and mind, which are part of the cosmic substance of matter and mind and life. You have only essential being, and then you have life. But your life boundary is not just inside the body, it is also extending beyond the body into everything else with which you feel the continuum of life, continuum of mind, continuum even of the physical body, senses and experience. The flower is not other than I in a consciousness that is infinite. It experiences the meeting of infinity with infinity. And so life is including everything. Your body and mind is only a special focal point with a boundary of a special wave, of the larger wave. But then there is something which is essential, which is not this, and that is your essential being, the pure essential consciousness which is playing out and experiencing this. That also is taken up. So all our life, as well as all our essential being, is transformed into the possession of Satchidananda. So if you look back now at what we have read, there was always this double aspect. What you are subjectively is now experienced to become more and more this infinite awareness, knowledge, will, delight, and being. And then all of its expression in relation with things also increases in this infinite light and action of the will and force, which is one but infinite, and the play of the delight and the expression of the one being from which everything comes, into which it goes. And so you have subjectively the oneness with the Satchidananda, and objectively in the play in the universe, you see the one divine Satchidananda unfolding and playing out. And still there is no dissolution of form, there is no breakdown of boundaries, which allows for the revealed play of the delight in form, through form, in relationships. And even it allows for the play of concealment by choice. You may choose to conceal for the purpose of the play, as when children play hide and seek. But you know that you conceal, you are never actually in ignorance. It is the game that you see when actors play out on the stage. when they know that they are not actually that character, and yet they choose to identify passionately with the character and all its strengths and weaknesses for the delight of the play. Even in this revealed experience of the Satchidananda, there is growth which is possible because boundaries still exist, but they are now waves which are growing and which are playing. They are not fundamental limitations, they are not fundamental incapacities or ignorances. They do not convey any sense of the pain, pleasure, indifference. All is play of delight in growth. So the mother describes, even in the supramental world, there are the souls which are still less developed, like children. And then there are those which are more mature and more developed, and the growth continues. That's the beauty of this lower half of the cosmos now, compared to the upper half, where all is there in the infinity. There is no sense of growth. Of course, there is unfolding delight unendingly, but the experience of limitation and play through limitation and growth belongs to the lower half, into which now we entered for this purpose, in which now the whole nature of our source, our origin, and the play of delight is revealed, and the growth continues. But the mother speaks of the reversal of this growth. It changes form. While earlier the growth was one of awakening out of ignorance into revealed knowledge, power, delight, now it takes a reversal. It becomes a growth to manifest the infinite possibilities which are in the Satchidananda above, now in the domain of form. To bring into manifestation something which was not. An aspect of knowledge, an aspect of force and will, an aspect of delight, a certain experience which has never been had before. All of which are there in the potentiality above, now put forward in form, within boundaries of form and play, with possibility of their growing further and experiencing increases and variations of form. And that's the nature of the revealed evolution of the Satchidananda thereafter. So all of this is taking place as the dawning of the sun, the uplifted into the supramental light. These are the changes taking place until all our life, as well as all our essential being, is transformed into the possession of Satchidananda. And this word possession is again in the Vedic vocabulary as distinct from glimpses, reflections, temporary receptions of some descents, experiences, partial experiences or partial realizations. None of these are possession. Possession is when you have it. Now, let's take an analogy. I possess this flower when I have it in my hand. But do I really possess it? Somebody can come and pry it out of my hands and forcibly take it away. I hold a butterfly. Is the butterfly living or dead? I possess it. It is my choice whether it lives or dies. I can crush it or I can release it. But if I choose to crush it, do I have the butterfly anymore? It's dead, it's gone. The act of grasping and enclosing is not possession. The act of eating is not possession. It still passes through you. The act of owning with a title deed on a paper is still not possession. Possession is when you are one with it in a way that there is no more a separation, that it cannot be taken away from you anymore. You see, you can have temporary possession. So you have a body which you possess, but for how long? For the duration of your lifetime. After that, your body is shed or it is taken away by force, even if you try to extend beyond a point. So you don't really possess it, or it was temporary possession. But the true possession of the body will be when I can take it and do with it as I will, even extending its form and its vitality and youth for as long as I want. Such would be the nature of the divinized body. It doesn't mean the body would be kept permanently. You may choose to discard, modify, or replace it. But if it is possessed, you will have the free choice to do with it as you want. And so when he uses this term, transformed into possession of the Satchidananda, it means that you are one with it in a way that it can never be separated or lost. But it may continue to grow because it is not entirely yours yet. You are one with it, but there is a continuing movement of the Satchidananda manifesting and growing in you and through you, and that is the movement of your further evolution. But it is possessed, it will never be lost. It's the foundation of what you are and the life that is expressed from you. So you see that each word here is extremely important. These are passages which are very dense, but they contain so much in terms of what they lead you to glimpse and to experience. And with this now we see why the supramental consciousness is essential. Its emergence is essential if we are to break free from that fundamental limitation that mind brought to our knowledge, to our capacity, to our will and everything else, where we saw even after reaching infinity, you can still have an infinite ignorance. And it is the supermind which is the first poise of consciousness, which is infinity and can possess all facets of infinity in its oneness. And it is that alone which can therefore, as he says, complete and really execute this awakening and the transformation, the unification of the upper and the lower halves of the cosmos. With this now, Sri Aurobindo is stepping back to the big picture of the yoga practice itself. Remember, all this while it was the yoga of integral knowledge, which aims at the realization of the one divine existence. There is also before this the discussion of the yoga of integral works, and after this the yoga of integral love. The karma yoga, jnana yoga and bhakti yoga. Into each of these he brings the integral dimension. And so now he steps back and shows you how this, which has been reached through the yoga of integral knowledge, relates to the other two paths. By way of this integral knowledge, we arrive at the unity of the aims set before themselves by the three paths of knowledge, works, and devotion. Each of these set itself a different aim. But all these three aims have united themselves now as we have reached the culmination of the integral knowledge. And how? Knowledge aims at the realization of true self-existence. Works at the realization of the divine conscious will, which secretly governs all works. Devotion at the realization of the bliss which enjoys as the lover all beings and all existences. Sat, Chit Tapas and Ananda. Each therefore aims at possessing Satchidananda through one or other aspect of his triune divine nature. So now we understand what he is aiming at. Let's look at the phrasing he uses for each of these aims. Knowledge aims at the realization of true self-existence. What does that mean? I am, I exist, I know that I exist, which is our starting point for a conscious life. The ape who exists, who is not conscious of his self-existence consciously. He is conscious that he exists. He has instinctively the fear of being destroyed, to not exist. But he is not conscious in awareness of his self-existence. Does not have the sense of free choice. It is driven by the impulse that seizes him. In the human being, because I'm conscious of my self-existence, I can consciously direct this existence. Unfortunately, I discover also that this existence is not really stable. It's not lasting. Itself is divided. It appears to be this sometimes and the other sometimes and something else altogether. It's not true. It's not real. It depends on circumstances. When the tiger leaps before me, my self-existence changes. When I am in the company of friends, my self-existence changes. At every time, my self-existence in a large part reflects my circumstances. What am I truly? What do I really want? We go through this crisis several times in life. First, when the instinct of rebellion comes in teenage. All this while I've been taught by parents, by society to be this, to do that. And suddenly, I don't want any of this. And what do I want? And the first fulfillment of the self-existence is precisely in breaking the forms, to go against all that I was taught, to rebel. And now I'm free. Except in the rebellion itself, I was following an instinct. So further along life, when I've followed certain instinctive impulses which were my freedom, again those are thrown into question and I'm made to introspect again. What is it that I really want? Because I want many things. And I realize the many things are conflicting. What do I really want? What is my deepest wanting? What is my truest? And one begins a kind of an introspection through layers. We realize that we have many wants, many likes, many dislikes. We are many people on many levels. But what is my most lasting, most true, most independent of circumstance? Least formed by my nature and external training, heredity and influence. And that's when one begins to go deeper into the introspection. That's about as far as we go in a typical normal life. In the spiritual life, you are told that there is much more. And that finding that is going to give you the true sense of freedom. And so you are consciously trying to go further. But essentially, behind it is the need to know yourself truly. And then he uses the phrase true self-existence. Now, the existence points to something else. It points to something which is not changing. I exist essentially in spite of my mind, life, body changing. There is the sense that there is deep inside me something which is permanent, unchanging, which is me, and therefore the true me. But of course there's nothing, no evidence of it anywhere except a deep intuition. It being there gives me the sense of permanence or wanting to be permanent in my thoughts, in my emotions, in my actions. So, the knowledge aims at the realization of true self-existence, and this relates directly to the aspect of Sat, of the Satchidananda. It is permanent, it is the most essential existence. Works aims at the realization of the divine conscious will. He uses capital for conscious and will, which secretly governs all works. And so here we have not studied those chapters in this way, but you will find here the central idea behind the way of works, that every time you have intended to do something, you discover that the impulses which led you to do it were much more deep and much more complex. If you go deeper behind, you find that there are compulsions which are even beyond yourself, which are societal compulsions. If you go deeper still, you will find there are compulsions which are beyond society. They form societies even. Now, if humanity is to evolve, there has to be somewhere along the way an attempt to develop certain capacities of your mind, certain skills of your body. And if Earth evolution did not develop those parts, well, the evolution would be incomplete. It's as if there is a compulsion to develop those parts somewhere on earth, even if it is in isolation. And having developed in isolation, there is a compulsion for that isolated development to now spread all over the earth if it is to fulfill itself. And so you keep going back and introspecting, you discover there is some kind of an underlying necessity. And this is the phrase the Greeks use. An underlying necessity which drives all the universe. It's what science discovers, but with a different vocabulary. It sees a chain of cause and effect, and it calls it law. Laws of physics. Who makes for the law? Who ensures the law is followed? Who intervenes if you try to break the law? You see, the moment you say law, all these questions would come up, but science ignores them. And the idea behind law is there is something which will compel whether you like it or not, and you can never go against it. And all of this comes back to the single one idea, a will, which works. Everything, no exception. And as long as that will has chosen to do something, everything will get to that result irrespective of what you do. Even if you go against it, somehow it uses that to fulfill itself. Except Sri Aurobindo uses the phrase divine conscious will. That science does not see that the will is conscious. If we observe evolution though, we cannot but conclude that there is some intelligence at work in this compulsion of the will. It's so beautifully designed, it's so deeply interconnected and intricate that mere chance would never explain the complexity of the interdependencies. So we naturally recognize that there's an intelligence in this will. Intelligence implies awareness. Is it a conscious intelligence or a mechanical intelligence? Even if it's a mechanical intelligence, it's aware of what's happening and adapts to what's happening to fulfill intelligently its purpose. So you may call it unconscious intelligence, but still it is a kind of consciousness. But to claim that it is unconscious would be false if we recognize that the outcome of the intelligence's working is awakening of consciousness. We are awake as a product of the will, so that could not be unconscious. It has to be at least as awake as us if it could bring us to wakefulness. And if our wakefulness is not complete, then it is much more awake than us. So it is a conscious will for sure, which works everywhere secretly through all things. And then he uses the word divine conscious will. It is the divine himself as conscious will, unfolding and executing. And the moment you recognize that, or you seek to realize that, the way by which you seek to realize that and to align your will to that and become a conscious instrument of that, that becomes the path of works, to which Sri Aurobindo dedicates several chapters in the Synthesis of Yoga, and the Yoga of Divine Works he is titled, which covers 13 chapters. And in the same way now, you see how what this does is, it uses our will, the impulse of our will as the means by which we discover the true doer of works. Even as the path of knowledge uses our impulse to become aware, to discover the true essential self-existence. And the third path, he says, devotion aims at the realization of the bliss which enjoys as the lover all beings and all existences. And this path seeks to realize that through the heart's devotion and the heart's love. So, if the recognition is that everything is held by and sustained and nourished by the bliss, it is the bliss which enjoys itself in all things, expresses itself as all things. How would you enter in relation with it? With the form that the bliss takes in the relationships, in forms as love. The mother, in one of her very interesting descriptions, points to this power of love as the thing which works even at the level of the subatomic particles. It is this underlying love which brings the particles together. And the love bringing it together is what the scientist observes and names it as force, and calls it a universal law and force. But it is a universal love. And the bliss which is playing as this particle is the same bliss which is playing as that particle, and the only relationship it can set with itself is the expression of the love. The drawing the bliss to meet bliss. And if it is so at the level of particles, it organizes itself all the way up into the human existence in more and more complex forms. And in us, it is the heart's opening in self-giving that is the leading point. When it seeks to express or seek love in relation to things and people, secretly, it is only reflecting and expressing the love that the divine has and the play of its bliss in the relationship. Except because it has caught the form and not the divine, which is the source and the termination of the love, it loses the glimpse. It catches something and loses, and catches and loses, somehow cannot hold. And so the path of the divine love turns that imprint, that impulse to the divine in all beings, in all things, and then seeks internally, subjectively to turn to its source until it is not your human love but the divine love working through your heart, which reaches out to the divine in all things. And thus, devotion aims at the realization of the bliss which enjoys as the lover all beings and all existences. The reality is this: although we are not conscious, it is the divine seated within us, always blissful, which is the lover relating to all things as the lover enjoying all these relationships. And we awake to that through the path of divine love. So here this path represents or seeks the aspect of Ananda, of Satchidananda. So the three are Sat, Chit, Tapas, Ananda, or representing them. Each aims at possessing Satchidananda through one or other aspect of his triune divine nature. You see, he never refers to Satchidananda as it, his triune nature. It is conscious being, it is conscious divinity. So it is always he. And then he describes how it happens. By knowledge, we arrive always at our true, eternal, immutable being, the self-existent, which every I in the universe obscurely represents. And we abrogate difference in the great realization. Soham, I am he. While we arrive also at our identity with all other beings. And then he explains how the same gives us also the knowledge of the force which works and the aspect of love and all bliss across the next two paragraphs. But here what he's done is, having brought us to the culmination of the path of integral knowledge, we see how it bridges and unites with the other two paths. Equally, when describing the other two paths, the way of divine works, the way of divine love, he shows how as integral paths, he broadens them out from the conventional narrow systems of practice, gives them an integral goal, and as integral paths they unite, merging all three again. The result is an interesting base for the practice of the integral yoga. Whether you begin with the aspect of knowledge or love or works, because you've set yourself an integral framework commensurate for the larger goal of the integral yoga, You grow through these three movements until all three awaken, whatever your starting point. And all three awakening set up a common base in which the ego has been dissolved, the mind has turned to the conscious identification with the Divine One, the heart has opened to the love and the bliss of the Divine, and the will has become a transparent instrument for the Divine will. And all this is set up without a fundamental change of your nature. It is a liberation from the ignorance, but the highest that your nature can rise, and creates a base for the supramental yoga proper, which is the yoga of self-perfection, which builds on top of this base and sets up the relationship where the divine consciousness penetrates now this awakened conscious instrument and begins to transform all this working into its terms, divinizing all these movements, fundamentally changing them. So towards the end of each of these descriptions, you will find increasingly he relates the movement and its fulfillment to the supramental, as we have just done in the study in relation to the yoga of integral knowledge. Having set up these links, later on, when it takes up the yoga of self-perfection, he goes straight into the supramental, the awakening of the supramental consciousness, its development, its unfoldment, and how it links into all these movements which have been prepared through this triple path, and fulfills and perfects them and divinizes them. And this whole big picture is the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo. It is so comprehensive that any system, any path, any practice, any philosophy, you will find included in it as an aspect or as a part or as an exaggeration of something which is more complete, or as a special narrowing of what could otherwise be broad. The framework is so broad, every human being, as they are, where they are in their current evolution, fits in and can begin from where they are, with no prior requirement. It is so broad that every activity of life can be included in the overall process and practice of the yoga. Nothing as a form of life needs to be rejected. What is rejected is only the distortions of the forms of life. And so these make for what Sri Aurobindo has earlier described as the three outstanding features of the integral yoga, which do not exist in any other system of yoga, of the specialized systems. So with this we will pause for today, because it brings us to a very important broad conclusion which we can then allow to soak in and allow ourselves to somehow broaden into this vision. Remember, all of this which is described in sequence as a framework is described only because it is understood in this way. In the practice, all of these aspects may be simultaneous to different degrees. So even as the yoga of integral knowledge is developing, the link with the supermind has been made here through this truth-mind principle which is already inside us, opening to that and receiving from it the truth, direct truth perceptions. And all the preparation for an eventual supramentalization can already begin now. What is not included in this discussion in the synthesis of yoga, but what is implied, and which he has later developed in detail in his last few articles, is what he has called the mind of light. And in what we have just read, if you read between the lines, so to say, the mind of light is implied, but not explicit. It is that status where the current working of our mind as an instrument of ignorance, because it is bound to division, can be so transformed by an action of the supramental light working in it, so lifted that, although working as an instrument of division, it can be free of ignorance, essentially. And this state or this poise or status of mind he has called the mind of light, on the basis of which we can begin to experience a divine life on earth without waiting for the full divinization of our whole nature. And this is the special gift that he left us, not only as a form of practice, but also as a form of the consciousness which has been developed in him, organized in him. It has not been so far developed in human evolution. It could not be developed unless the supramental consciousness was infused into the mind, and with that, having developed it within his own consciousness, you will remember the mother describing how he imprinted it directly into her. That event, when he left his body, when he imprinted the mind of light into her, is extremely significant because the mother held in herself the whole of humanity. She had consciously connected herself to the whole of human nature, human consciousness and the earth consciousness. All of the prayers and meditations which you read were prayers written when she identified with the earth consciousness and articulated earth's aspiration to the divine. And already at that point she had made that link. That was her function as the mother. And so when she received this mind of light from Sri Aurobindo, it was imprinted into humanity. And as a result, it's already there as a power, as an organized power working in us, to the extent that our mind is able to receive the higher light of what he has here described as the awakening of the truth mind and the reception of the direct truth perception from the supermind, in its most basic form as the action of intuition. To the extent that we are beginning to open to this and we are able to widen to it, the mind of light begins to get organized because it's already there as an organized power. If you remember our study of this, of the text where Sri Aurobindo discusses the emergence of the mind of light, he speaks of two phases. The first phase where it assembles its basic material, and the second phase where it comes into its own as an active, organized mind and then grows through that. The first phase is already happening on a large scale. The signs of it are in the young children, in the way their minds are naturally more wide, where they seek naturally not to be bound to narrow viewpoints, but to somehow broaden to large, multiple perspectives and so on. But this is still happening instinctively. They're not conscious of why it is. The imprint is working on humanity in spite of ourselves. In a few who are conscious and who make the conscious effort to open to the higher light, there is the infusion of the light which makes for the organization and the preparatory forms of the mind of light, which one can glimpse working already in a rudimentary way in some people. And the sign of it is that there is a spontaneous intuition, but the intuition is wide. And it works, and they live in it, by it when it works, and when it doesn't work, they choose not to fall back in the normal mind working. Because having experienced this, that is no more satisfying. You do not wish to fall back into it. And in the few individuals in whom this is already developed, you can see the work has begun. And this is happening right now. And to the extent that we participate consciously, we can grow into this without too much effort. The effort required is to consciously prepare the mind to receive the intuition and open to the light and receive and hold the light and grow in wideness increasingly. All the rest is done by its action. Just as we saw earlier, the logic of why the emergence of the light of the supermind puts everything naturally into order. It's so logical, it's so reasonable. We understand the mechanism of that working and the relationship. So it is with the working of the mind of light. So this is the framework on which we can keep what he has shown us. In the next two paragraphs which end the chapter, he shows how the yoga of integral knowledge bridges with the yoga of works and the yoga of love, but in much detail. And we'll continue this next Friday. We can take a few minutes for comments, questions.
It's just in relation to the underlying theme, I guess, of your talk about consciously aspiring and connecting to the light. And given it is so close to Sri Aurobindo's birthday, I was wondering if you could perhaps say a few words about the significance of his birthday and darshan and how we can benefit from it most. And also, my favorite aspects of your talks always are when you give these little anecdotes from ashram archives and ashram folklore. So if there are any little tales of some of the great sadhaks of the past and their experiences of darshan with Sri Aurobindo, that would be awesome.
That would be a few hours in itself. But what Mother prepared us for, which was also the message which was given on the darshan day, what she prepared us for on the occasions of the darshan was to be able to receive what was given. In physical form, you had the opportunity to stand before Sri Aurobindo and the Mother in their physical presence and to receive whatever they gave. In reality, the gift that is given is not dependent on your standing in front. It is dependent on your opening to them and their imprinting. So the value of the darshan is irrespective of whether you are in front of them with their physical body or not. So it applies everywhere that you are on earth. But what is special on those occasions is that something is given for which a preparation has been made, it has been gathered, and then it is given with an intensity. And then of course, to the extent that you are able to receive, you receive, and to the extent you are able to contain, you are able to keep and not lose. So much of Mother's preparation that she made us go through was this two aspects, receiving and containing. Otherwise you received, it stayed for the half day or one day and then it's gone because you could not contain. In the experiences people had at that time, of course, varied, diverse, again based on receptivity. We had one which immediately comes to mind is Panditji's sister. She recalls her first darshan as she turned the corner of the stairs and entered the space where the hall just before where they're sitting. And she said everywhere it was just white light, intense white light. And so intense, she said, where are Sri Aurobindo and Mother? There's only light. And this is one to other experiences where people go and they would bow down and receive the blessing and it's a blank. You don't remember anything, what happened. You just come away full and in a daze. In one experience which I found narrated recently, which was quite common to many. I was visiting the US in the community called Crestone. And so the very evening, as soon as I arrived, somebody was there for dinner and he said, I came to meet you when I heard that you came from Sri Aurobindo Ashram. And he said, I had met the Mother once. And then it was, he said, the most amazing experience. And then he began to narrate his experience. So he was at that time in Chennai, working on some sustainable development. Auroville had just started, and so he came to Auroville, stayed for 2 weeks, and he kept hearing about this Mother. And somebody told him he should go and meet her. And he said, why? Well, just an old lady, what's the point? Okay, she had a nice idea of Auroville. but what will I do meeting her? And they said, no, you should just go. So he went expecting nothing. We entered the room, and as he approached her, he looked at her, and then he doesn't know why, he just fell at her on his knees. And then he said, he was describing this, he said, he just felt waves and waves of love, and such an incredible love. And then it was as if layers and layers were unfolding. And he said, I was bounced around all over the universe, and layers were unfolding. And I don't know what happened to me. I was so overwhelmed, and there was such an intense love pouring into me from her and from me. And I don't know what happened. And he had just tears streaming from his eyes as he was narrating this. And he said for 3 days he lived in that. He doesn't know what happened. He doesn't know when he ate. He doesn't know when he slept. He doesn't know when he walked. He was just in this. And then after 3 days he came. The experience gradually dimmed, had to, because he couldn't contain beyond a point. But he could receive. This is the point. And he came and he approached Panditji and said, I don't know what to do with my life after this experience. I don't know what to do. To live in the ashram would be too restrictive, and I can't live a normal life in the world after having experienced this. What should I do? Please ask the mother. So Panditji went to the mother, came back with a letter from the mother, addressed to the Dalai Lama, introducing this man to the Dalai Lama, and the message to him was, you go and work and serve the Dalai Lama. Amazing. So he said, I went to the mother and she gave me this incredible experience, bounced me around the universe, and then sent me to the Dalai Lama. And of course he was one of the major promoters subsequently of the Dalai Lama in the West. He created documentaries and so on. Obviously she saw the line of evolution that his soul had chosen was in that direction, but she gave him what was necessary for his work, and what she gave was so extraordinary, and it was just given like that in a few seconds, or we don't know how long it was. So subsequently I recorded him narrating this, and then I asked him, well, why don't you come now to visit the ashram? It would be so nice. You will see how much Auroville has developed. You saw its beginnings. It will be a wonderful experience. And he was hesitant. He said, I'm afraid to be disappointed. You see, having had that experience, he would rather retain this and not go back to experience something which was anything less than. And I could appreciate what he meant by that. And all of his life, it is this which has carried him and defined his life, literally. So the message for us is really this. To the extent we are ready, she will give and shape our lives, define our lives. It's a new birth after that. Every darshan is a special occasion in that sense, but then every day and every moment can be made also a special occasion. So the only way we can express our gratitude is to be worthy of the gifts. Oh.